Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm Shannon Makes, professional athlete and performer by night, casual customer by day. As someone who only very recently started her own historical costuming journey, I was a bit unsure at first if I'd have anything to contribute to this year's costume symposium, but then it struck me that I should take my inexperience and turn it to my advantage. So this one is for everyone out there that is relatively new to the costuming world, whether you're here because you want to add some historical touches to a cosplay, you love history bounding, or you really just want to go to all those fancy balls you hear about. And even if you're not new and you're just here for the badge code, hopefully you stick around and pick up a new idea or two to add to your own costuming toolkit. First off, I want to start with the quick disclaimer that this is my personal advice and that I can only speak from my own viewpoint. I've tried to include several other options or methods besides my own, but there are surely many others out there that I have forgotten or not even thought of. One solution will not fit all, and the most important takeaway is that there's no wrong way to get into historical costuming. There are many right ways, but if at any point someone tells you that you are doing this the wrong way, going about your historical costuming journey incorrectly, feel free to ignore them because we don't need gatekeeping in this community and certainly not on my channel. So let's jump in. I think a good place to start might be asking yourself why you're interested in historical costuming in the first place and what about it interests you. I mentally broke these up into sort of three main options: connecting with history, pretty outfits, and socializing. So let's take a closer look at those. If you are super interested in feeling a connection with the past or doing some experimental archaeology, then you might prioritize historical accuracy. And I'm giving this huge air quotes because true 100% historical accuracy is impossible. But you can still strive to study and use period methods, remain loyal to period silhouettes, and use as close to period materials as possible in an approach I'll call historically adjacent. Maybe you just adore the fashion and you want to dress up in pretty outfits. You're not so interested in historical accuracy per se, but you love the look of wearing clothing from the past, whether that's a magnificently poofy dress or a dapper three-piece suit. Maybe you want to do full-out historical costuming outfits or the slightly more toned-down approach of history bounding or fantasy bounding, and you're fine with using a serger and some modern fabrics if it gets the job done. And last but not least, perhaps you're mainly into the social aspect. You like the idea of dressing up, but what really attracts you is sharing that passion with other like-minded folks and attending social events with your friends. So what about you? What drew you to historical costuming? Do you fall into one of these categories, a combination of a couple, or is there another reason altogether that I've neglected to mention? Now that you hopefully know what your priorities are, I found it easiest to proceed by nailing down what time period I was interested in, or at least which one I wanted to start with. As a newbie, I found it easier to focus on one era in order to avoid being overwhelmed and hitting project paralysis. If your number one priority is the community aspect, start by looking up which events you'd like to attend or are accessible to you, and let that guide your costuming era. If you have a specific event you'd like to attend, like the Gatsby Picnic, the Costume Ball in Versailles, or a Renaissance Festival, then those events will naturally help set the parameters of what time period you should costume for. Instead of picking a specific event, you might choose instead to look at what's happening local to you. If there are only one or two groups or events in your area, then you might choose to costume specifically for the eras they specialize in. This is also a great route to go if you're nervous about getting started and the idea of having other, more experienced costumers in your area who could potentially help you is appealing. If you're more into bounding, then that might naturally gravitate you towards certain time periods. Steampunk looks might lean towards 1880s and the bustle gown, whereas fantasy bounding often gravitates more towards medieval styles. If you just want a pretty outfit, then you might think about what elements are most attractive to you personally and look into those time periods. What silhouettes or stylings are you in love with? Do you adore the floof and frills of Marie Antoinette and the Rococo era? Or the loads of lace of the Edwardian? Perhaps the huge poofy sleeves of the mid-1890s calls to you, or it's the bustle skirts of the 1880s. These elements may help guide you to narrow down a time period. And if you're into history bounding, the same basic thoughts apply, but with the additional filter of thinking about what are you comfortable wearing in public. Some of these fashions are more conspicuous than others, or have elements that can easily be incorporated into more toned down versions of their original historical counterparts. And if approaching historical accuracy is more your thing, then while there is some amount of knowledge and information out there for historical practices in nearly every time period, it's also going to be true that some periods come with information that is more plentiful and more easily accessible to the general public than others. For me personally, one of the reasons I chose the late Victorian period, even though it was Outlander that got me started in historical costuming, was the wealth of easily accessible primary source material. Being in Denmark but not speaking Danish, and with no access to North American library systems, online resources such as archive.org and the Library of Congress were a great way for me to get free access to primary sources such as drafting manuals and fashion magazines of the time. Now it's your turn. What era or eras have you fallen in love with and why? Can you narrow it down to one, or are you still waffling between a few? Now that you've hopefully narrowed your time frame down a little bit, it's time to learn about the fashions of that time. Become a sponge and learn as much as you can, want, or have time or interest for. This stage will vastly vary from person to person and can be as simple as a Pinterest search for outfits from your era of choice, or as extensive as a deep dive into various rabbit holes about every single article of clothing involved in the fashions of the time. Other research options, in no particular order or judgment, include visiting libraries or buying books with relevant material, watching costubers in your time period, finding costuming groups on Facebook specific to your era, and contacting museums to chat about or examine their extant garments. While we're here, I would urge you to spend some time researching the history and impact of these fashions on marginalized people of the era. Much, if not all, of the fabric that these clothes were made from exacted a huge toll on marginalized, colonized, and enslaved peoples at all stages of production. There is no perfect time period you can choose that will get you out of having to confront racism, anti-Semitism, or any of the other horrors of history, and while you may choose not to dwell on it, I do strongly urge you to at least be aware of whose blood, toil, tears, and sweat went into the production of these garments. This whole research stage can be the most fun or the least interesting depending on who you are, and it can take as long or be as brief as you like. But beware, because this phase can go on indefinitely, and at some point you have to pull a trigger, take all the knowledge and information that you've gathered up until now, and devise a plan. So what about you? Where do you fall on this spectrum? Do you love researching or despise it? Will you lose yourself in the annals of history, or do you prefer perusing Pinterest? Remember, there's no right or wrong answer. Again, this is highly personal and should be based on things like your skill level, confidence, budget, constraints, both time and health-wise, and your personality and preferred method of creation. It can be as detailed or as vague as you need to succeed and flourish. If you are completely new to sewing in general and nervous about starting off, a good plan might be to start with a pre-made pattern from a reputable company and to use cheaper or repurposed materials. Having a good pattern, one which will come with clear instructions and a multitude of size options, will eliminate some of the stress of trying to come up with a pattern on your own, and using cheaper materials should eliminate at least some of the pressure of cutting into the fabric. If you're nervous about the process or paralyzed by trying to choose the perfect materials, you can also order a kit with all of the appropriate materials and instructions to make certain items yourself, such as the corset kits from Red Threaded. This is not cheating, and anyone who tells you otherwise can go eat worms. If it helps you to get to the point where you can wear and enjoy a finished product, it's just another tool in your toolbox. For people who don't have loads of free time or who are working under a deadline, ordering some parts such as undergarments and accessories pre-made is an option if you can afford it. Or if you're making things for yourself, don't add all of the extra touches at once. Design your costume in a way that it's still wearable without all the extra bits and bobs, and then you can always come back and add more layers and details to it later. This will allow you to finish it faster and can spread the cost out. If you have a fair amount of confidence and have more time than money, or maybe if you're going for as close to historically accurate as possible, then you could also draft it yourself. By now, at this step, you probably have an idea of how these garments were made, and you might even have stumbled across drafting methods in your research. Or at least articles that mentioned construction methods, since as far as I know, the Vikings didn't bother to leave behind any drafting manuals. Alternatively, if you have access to a mannequin, you could drape something. You could find an old piece of clothing that fits you well and cut it up to make a pattern out of it, or Frankenstein a couple of these methods together to suit your purposes. Whatever your constraints, there's probably a solution out there for you. Just be sure to know yourself and factor the human into the equation. If you tend to lose interest in projects quickly, then maybe choose a plan that is straightforward without too many unnecessary detours. Maybe your health or your schedule puts certain limitations on your creative process, and it might be better to embrace that rather than set overly ambitious goals and be forced to abandon your project partway through. This plan can be as simple as drawing an outfit, having an idea of the colors you want to use, or getting a couple store-bought patterns. Or it can be as complicated as a material list of every garment and trim, specific drafting methods, a list of primary sources, a fabric swatch book, or journaling every step of the way. What matters most is that it works for you personally and will aid you in getting this process done. Knowing how best you work is very helpful for this stage. Tell me in the comments what your plan looks like, or what you think it might look like based on what you know of yourself and how you create. This part is admittedly both one of my favorites and also sometimes one of my least favorites. I've experienced both immense pleasure and incredible frustration at this step, and often that comes down to how detailed a plan I've gone in with and how flexible I am with that plan. And sometimes it just requires a mental reframing of the situation. For me, when I've gotten overwhelmed, it was always with trying to choose the perfect material for the project, as if there was one choice out there that was the right one, and anything else was wrong or lesser. And it may be a part of the reason why I enjoy working with recycled materials so much. The process always gets a bit easier once I step back and take the pressure off having to find the perfect option and instead find a very good option. Remember, historical accuracy is not possible. It's not a thing, and especially if this is your first outfit, my advice is not to waste hours of your life going back and forth looking for the perfect materials. Choose what is best for your budget, what looks good to you or feels comfortable, or that you have easy access to. If it means you order something online because you don't have fabric stores in your area, that's fine. If you can't afford yards and yards of wool, don't feel pressured to do so just because your favorite costumers are raving about wool. Some people may scoff at the idea of sourcing fabric in the form of bed sheets or other linens at the thrift store, but ultimately their opinion doesn't matter. If this is what works for you, if that's how you can get started in historical costuming, that's amazing. And I would also like to point out that repurposing material for costumes is not even necessarily a choice that people make because they can't afford better materials. I could buy all my fabric if I really wanted to, but I actually enjoy the thrill and challenge of repurposing fabric and trying to find creative solutions to work with strange shapes. That's part of the joy for me, and I'm not about to let anyone shame me because I'm walking around wearing an IKEA couch. For me, that's a selling point, not a defect. If you're interested in recycling and repurposing materials, I will be doing a panel on using recycled materials in costuming and props with Kayla of N00b Makes later today, so be sure to check that out. What about you? Do you enjoy the challenge of working with repurposed materials, or do you prefer to start with clean yardage? Are you overwhelmed by options, or is this your favorite part of the process? Let me know down below. This is where you take a deep breath, cross your fingers and your toes, and start the actual work. I think it's very important here to say that you should be kind to yourself and be willing to make mistakes. Even the most experienced sewists make mistakes. It's normal and part of the process. What matters is not that you make mistakes, but how you handle them and recover from them. And I think keep calm and carry on is a very good adage here. Again, how you get started and how you create is so incredibly personal. Can you tolerate a garment that doesn't fit perfectly but gets done quickly? And I say that with no judgment, but as an honest question. Will you be driven mad by even a small mistake that you make and be eternally unsatisfied until you've remedied it? Think about what you're comfortable with and try to keep that in mind as you start the process. I would suggest trying to be at least a little bit flexible and keeping at least a casual record of lessons learned, although I realize that both of these things can actually make the creative process even more stressful for some, so your mileage may vary. If you're super into writing and documenting the process, then a dedicated journal or sewing Bible might be right up your alley. Some people prefer to film the entire process and put it on YouTube because they're masochists. Otherwise, just a few notes scribbled on the pattern pieces does the job. Or maybe you take photos of tricky steps to help you at similar stages of future costumes. Ideally, this saves you from making the same mistake twice. This advice can also be applied to other makers too. If you see one of your favorite costumers make a mistake or use a clever technique that you'd like to replicate, feel free to create a specific playlist or take notes in your own journal, so that you learn not only from yourself, but from others as well. This feeds right into my next point, which is to learn from your mistakes. We've already come to terms with the fact that we all, new or experienced, will be making some mistakes along the way, right? Well, here is where we carry on, learn from our mistakes, and improve for the next garment. Maybe you made a huge error and had to recut a large chunk of fabric, or spend hours unpicking stitches. Maybe you didn't make any big mistakes, but the experience you gained allows you to move faster through your next project. Or maybe you have a bit more confidence to splurge on slightly more expensive fabric next time. Maybe it just means you won't have to go back and unpick as many seams, or set a sleeve in 4 times before you get it right. Either way, the only way to get better is to make mistakes and learn from them. Anyone who's ever learned to ride a unicycle will surely understand. If this isn't your first project, tell me and everyone else watching one mistake you've made while sewing, how you handled it, and what you learned from it. Or just throw some kind words of encouragement and reassurance out there for people who might still be on the fence about starting their costuming journey off. That'll just about do it for me. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel to follow along as I continue to make my first historical costume, a late 1890s historical Hogwarts from an IKEA couch. If you're here for CoSy, the link for the badge is in the description, as well as my social media links and Ko-fi account where you can go to purchase a Tailor's ham and sausage for the sewist in your life with a good sense of humor. Here is my circus in a corset video where you can learn a bit more about sports corsets and get a glimpse into my actual job, and YouTube thinks you'll like this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope I see you in my next video. Bye!